Hi, everyone. So we are gathered here today to talk about the amazing Asian Detox Recap Roundtable. We have some great guests here, like Amanda, Julia, and Mary Grace, and just a few more who really give the insights about what is it like to be Asian American from different backgrounds, talking about wealth management and Asian identity. So I want to give it to TJ, our wonderful host of the podcast, who's going to talk about their experience doing it and also what can we expect in the next season. So off to you, TJ.
Yeah, thanks, Jenna. So I'm TJ Way. My pronouns are Z and Zer, and I'm really glad that we could get season one guests back together and do more of a roundtable style versus the interview style that I have been doing for season one. And I'm just so grateful to get to do this because the Asian Detox podcast is really like my version of living out loud, my own journey of reconnecting with what it means to be Asian in a Western culture, right? Like my parents are immigrants and I grew up in America, and it can be an isolating experience, especially when you're predominantly in spaces that aren't Asian. Even though I grew up in the Bay Area, I moved to Arizona, and that really made me feel like I separated from my roots. And I think that no matter how you grew up, that is commonplace, that people want to know where they're from, some of their history, some aspects that impact how they see themselves. So this podcast is really me reconnecting with other Asian Americans to talk through how that shows up in our lives so that I can kind of break some of the myths that I have in my head. So that's why it's called the detox, is to remove the myth that the Asian American community is toxic, because as my most recent episode says, my high school was very toxic. So I needed this forum to get me to a place where I can feel connected with this part of my identity. And it's been a great opportunity to talk about a lot of topics. And I definitely look forward to season two to improve on the process. And I think we'll save some of the peaks in the season two for a little later.
Sounds awesome. I think in this group, and if not more, can we relate to our upbringings and how that will influence us and our choices? So, just want to kick it off to opening this discussion. I want to give it to Mary Grace and ask you, like you may have mentioned in your podcast episode, but how do you preserve your family legacy? What does that mean to you?
So thanks so much for that question. I think for me, preserving family legacy and the legacy of my heritage. So by upbringing, if you haven't listened to that episode, I'm Filipina and my parents were both born in the Philippines, but I also have roots in England and in Spain, but predominantly practicing as Filipino in culture and born and raised here in the United States. So a very mixed in terms of identity and culture. And in terms of legacy, the way that I preserve it personally is through three things. So storytelling is one, curiosity is the second, and open communication would be the third. And for me, what legacy means is the identity, the stories that we pass down to future generations, and what each generation does to make the future generation better. And so when I say storytelling, that's been a huge thing in my family, where I'm one of those people who loves hearing stories from my aunts, my uncles, my mom, my dad, my grandparents when they were still here, and having those stories of what it was like for them in the Philippines, what was it like for them migrating to the United States, and the appreciation of just how different life was. And it helps me to get further rooted in the blessings that I have here, living here in the United States in the San Francisco Bay Area. The second I mentioned is curiosity. So for me, in terms of legacy, I was the one who was asking the questions. So in contrast to some folks who might be impressing the culture upon their children, in my upbringing, it was much more of a curiosity of mine to ask my parents about it, to ask my other family members about my upbringing. So much so that when I was in college, because I felt like I didn't know a whole lot about being Filipina, I took classes in college that had nothing to do with my major. I was a math major. And I dove into Filipino culture experiences in college. And so that curiosity is what fueled me. And then third, the open communication. So for legacy, I think to truly take hold is having that open communication between generations. So my parents just always had that open line with me to be honest about their experiences, things that they loved growing up, things that they didn't. And I'm finding as I get older and ask these questions and look at these stories from different perspectives, there's just so many layers of culture and identity. And I think that all, for me, is important parts of preserving the legacy in our family.
It has to be done. It really does. It really does. Family is our blood, is chosen, not chosen, is who we stand for. And so, Amanda, I understand you have little kids yourself. So talk to me about what's it like when you first became a parent, your upbringing as a child, your decision, and then what was it like to be a parent? What does legacy mean for you and your family?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And I grew up in Canada and I was born here, and my mom is from Malaysia. So she brought us up with Chinese culture, but I was always of both cultures. I didn't belong here and I didn't belong there. And then I got married and to a Caucasian person, and so our kids are mixed. And it's very interesting because my son goes to Mandarin school on Saturdays, and the other day, he's only 5. He's like, "Am I Chinese?" And I was like, "Oh, that was the first time he'd ever thought about that." And I was like, "Wow, do you think you're Chinese?" And so he's like, "Huh, I'm not sure." So it was very interesting. And I was like, "Well, you're actually half Chinese, right? You're half Asian, well, because mommy is Chinese, and then you're half Caucasian. So you are Chinese, and you're part of both cultures. You get to be the best of both cultures." And so that's what we've been teaching, is you get to choose the best of everything and incorporate that into who you are.
Amazing. Amazing. I'm sure that was a huge shock value when you first hear those words. And also, like, good for him for recognizing he has like blood, like the Chinese blood in his background, is what a journey he's about to go on. Now he's one step closer to clarifying it. That's awesome. Thank you. And I'm sure being in an interracial relationship can throw some obstacles of what is a legacy to both parents. Great. So Julia, on to you. You're doing big and amazing things. Like, I believe you have a nonprofit. Am I wrong about? Okay, so a nonprofit. Now, legacy is such a beautiful loaded word. What made you start a nonprofit? Was it because of legacy?
No, not really. It's a good segue in terms of listening to what Amanda and Mary Grace talked about. Is we really started this initiative called Make Noise Today, which is a part of a nonprofit organization. And it started when Stop AAPI Hate became a hashtag. And we wanted to make sure that we don't just react to what was happening, but respond, and to make sure that we're not doing something that's one-offs. And so we wanted to focus on what Mary Grace and Amanda were talking about, is amplifying Asian American voice and really trying to abate narrative scarcity. For our longest time, Asian Americans were kind of confined to a monolithic story, that there was this master story that the external environment wanted to apply to our legacy or story, because it was really much easier, and it really quite simpler if you just really apply for one master story. But we just wanted to make sure that while that Stop Asian Hate, Stop API Hate were trending as hashtag, we wanted to make sure that we focus on Asian American voice and to amplify the voice, and to make sure that we are allowing for different kinds of stories to be told. Some are funny stories, some are success stories, some are really colossal failure stories. Some are tragedy and some might be comedy, but regardless, we wanted to make sure that narrative plenitude is achieved. So we started this initiative or nonprofit, as you said, called Make Noise Today, to basically focus on that. So, listening to what Mary Grace and Amanda were talking about, it makes me feel good that we're on the right track in terms of making sure that we're continuing to support people telling story and making noise ourselves as well.
I love it. Julie, I think you like really opened up this conversation, right? Because I think we started from the family nucleus, and I personally don't have kids yet, so I can't really talk about what I'm doing in a family perspective around legacy. But what you're doing, Julia, is really saying like we want that variety, every story. And growing up, a lot of those stereotypes around being Asian American was that model minority conversation of, oh, we're super smart, we're good with money, like we focus on certain types of careers, things like that. And having these conversations with you guys has been extremely enlightening to me in terms of just how intentional that we've been in terms of trying to share the stories that are real, that make us human, that make us more than one slice of our identity, as well as how much like that intentionality plays a big part in not just how we raise our kids, but also how we tell these stories. Because I'll admit that I didn't have Mary Grace's curiosity asking my family about how they grew up or like what it was like when they moved to America. I just kind of assumed in that like weird entitled child way of like, oh, you should know what you're putting me through as the child of immigrants growing up in America and the cultural conflict that I was experiencing, because I saw it in my classmates. We all kind of had that, like when you first moved, like you don't know what you don't know. So I'm sure my parents did the best they could. And of course there wasn't internet when they moved. So they didn't really have a good way of understanding like what they'd signed themselves up for in terms of raising a child in this mixed culture. So I really appreciate being surrounded by people who are thinking about these things.
So beautifully well said. Well said. Let's take a pause right there. So I'm going to go off camera for a minute and just lean on you guys to help out. So Julia, I'm going to go back to you and we could kick things off. I have here something about how the younger generation fully embrace our Asianness.
That's a quote.
I, can I dial back in terms of correcting myself as well? But no. In terms of Asian American identity and how especially the younger generation embraces Asianness per se, is that we found that Asian American youth embrace their identity in a very different way than definitely my generation or your generation, which are much younger, younger than myself. We talked about during our podcast, we talked about the study, polycultural study that we did, is that we're just really kind of distancing or maybe leaning a little bit less towards this word called multiculturalism. Because we felt that it seems as though multiculturalism, even the term, kind of emphasizes on the otherness, that everyone is, the culture is very different, and that it's we versus them, the other culture. And polyculturalism, we found that especially amongst youth, is that they're very curious, like, what Mary Grace said, probably in her generation, maybe that was really kind of already seeded. It was that this generation is particularly interested in different cultures, more so than definitely my generation. And it seems as though assimilation, the so-called assimilation, is passé, right? So especially in the millennial, is that even melting pot or salad bowl doesn't fully embrace their identity, and specifically is that they're really very curious about other culture, and that they would like to embrace other culture as well. And specific to Asian Americans, it seems as though, especially the millennial or the younger generation, crave visibility. America's society's understanding of race can be simplistically black and white most of the time, and causing many Asian Americans who fit neither end to continue questioning how and where they belong. And I think when, I was listening to what Amanda was saying, I mean, there's also this, how do you segment mixed race, children who are mixed race as well? So this Asian Americans craving visibility is becoming more and more profound. It seems as though.
That sounds awesome. Well, Amanda, how do you respond to that? Because, Julie made really good points about assimilation. Well, before I go back to Julia to expand on that, Amanda, do you have any initial thoughts on the mixed race and whatnot?
I think that the younger generation is more curious, and so they are open-minded and looking to push outside barriers that they weren't before. Whereas with our generation, you have the box in there and you're trying to break out of the box. But if we can break out of the box, then there's no box for the generation that comes after us, right? So each generation pushes further and further out until there's a point where the box doesn't exist anymore. And so it allows people to accept their true identity and be curious of all the parts of who they are.
Awesome. I'm also just learning that, having mixed race kids can be common. We live in a whole melting pot of America. I'm so sure everyone's so tired of hearing that, but it's a fact, true, so true. And so I'm going to offer it to Mary Grace. Do you relate to this? When you were growing up, was there mixed race, or how do you relate to that?
I think growing up, there was a couple of different elements. I mentioned my parents and grandparents migrating from the Philippines to the United States, but my great grandfather was born and raised in the US and was in the military, and that's how he met my great grandmother, right? So there was already the mix going on. And in the Philippine culture, the Philippines was used as a base for so many different places that there's just so much of a mixture already, right? So our language was already infused with Spanish words. There's American customs that are over there already. And so I think for my upbringing, all of this kind of mixed identity was already normal to me. I grew up in a predominantly Latino community. And there was a lot of commonalities because of roots in Spain, right? So a lot of some of the language, some of the foods, some of the words that we use to describe things. So there was already that commonality. I am married to someone who is Mexican. So my children are also of multiracial background. And so I'm raising 3 boys, ages 7, 4, and 4 months. So as this whole Gen Alpha, I guess that's the new phase, it's normal for everything to be mixed, right? So when we have our holidays, there is Pancit, which is from the Philippines, and there's tamales, right, which are from Mexico. So we have, it's just already this mixture of it being normal. My 4-year-old is enrolled in a school that is 90% or more of those from parents who migrated from India. My oldest is in a Spanish immersion program. So there's already this normalcy of things just being different. And my 7-year-old is self-teaching himself Korean just because he thinks it's interesting to know. So I think there is even more that curiosity of just learning. And I feel like kind of like if you have interesting books on a shelf, right? And the pieces you find interesting and you want to adapt and adopt. And my husband and I, while we will always make available information from our backgrounds and make sure that our parents are sharing that information with our kids, I think there, at least for me in growing up, there was less of a desire for me to figure out what box I fit into. I did go through that phase where I want to learn more about the Philippines just because it just wasn't my upbringing as much to be so immersed in it. And once I had that dose, I felt great about knowing it, and it was part of my identity. But I also feel for this new generation in raising my kids, that there's just so much exposure to different cultures and customs, and it's just normal. And that they haven't yet shared with me that they don't feel like they fit in, even if they are of different race, and they are not seeking to put themselves in a box or not. They just want to learn more about all the things. And so I think that's really exciting for me to think about the new generations of our children and beyond, where while there is still that identity and those roots to where the previous generations came from, there's this openness of learning about other cultures and other traditions.
I absolutely love how like we've basically listened through the progression of like what access to other people's culture has really like made possible for how we see ourselves. And Amanda, your conversation about like breaking the boxes so that they get bigger until there's no box, like I really see that in like cannot wait for the day that we can like say that that's normal, right? That I'd say this gathering of amazing people today is probably more of an exception right now in terms of how much we think about these things and having these conversations, right? Even the willingness to talk about this is not something that I would typically see in like your stereotype of what an Asian family is, right? Like if it wasn't relevant to making your future better, it wasn't a story that needed to be told. Or I wouldn't say that my parents are very good about like identifying what their emotions are or anything like that. So like I really appreciate having this conversation and can really see how like sometimes you just have to let it go, right? Like when you're intentional and you don't give the next generation parameters that they have to stick to, it sounds like that actually is one of the key things to help them discover for themselves what they want to be or who they want to be. And I really love the concept of just learning Korean at the age of 7 for whatever reason, because we have so much access to like media. Like I can watch K-dramas and listen to K-pop, and like to me that was kind of my culture growing up, is that we were all just Asian American. Like I would say after I started going to college, we started sub-segmenting down to like what's like a Southeast Asian and a South Asian. Like those categories like didn't really exist when I was in high school, but we were so used to just being Asian in one way or another that we just swapped cultures all the time. So actually, Mary Grace, I'm curious, like kind of growing up in that environment where all of those cultures are already there, how much does it come up of like trying to identify where certain behaviors or traditions come from?
You mean upbringing in terms of the mixture of Asian cultures or just different cultures in general?
Different cultures in general.
So I think that I think that in my upbringing and in my surrounding, there was interest in figuring out like why do I say that, right? I literally was in a text chat with my family. It's my aunt's birthday. Happy birthday, Tita Sue, if you're listening to this. And we were talking about noodles and the significance of having noodles in Philippine culture on your birthday. I didn't know my whole life. I had no idea there was any purpose to it until this year when it was my son's birthday. And my mom was like very concerned that we weren't going to have pancit or some form of noodle. And at the end of the day, she said, can you just make sure you buy him noodles before midnight? And I thought, what is going on? And I finally asked her, I said, is there a significance behind the noodles? I know that there had been always pancit every birthday. I didn't know like why. And she said, oh, because it represents long life and it represents good luck. I just literally dropped that information in the chat and they all said, Mary Grace, did you not know that all your life? Like why? so yes, there had been interest in figuring out like why those elements are. I'm still learning today, right? Some of the things that had been part of my life, my whole life, and I did not realize why. I found out one recently and then shared that with other family members who might not have known that, right, of my generation, my cousins level. So I think that there is a beauty in finding out sometimes like why we do some of the things that we do and tracing the reasons, right? I feel like there's always a reason behind why people act or do or say certain things, and especially if it's a repeat behavior. And so I think growing up in that environment where things were just always just of mixed culture. Something that I picked up when I was growing up in a predominantly Latino culture or surrounding was the way we greeted each other in high school, right? It was very, very friendly, hugs and then like air kisses to the side. And then I forgot once when I was visiting my family and I did like the air kiss to the side with my family and they all kind of, and this was extended family, they all acted pleasantly surprised, like, whoa, oh, that's nice, right? And I realized, oh, that doesn't come from my culture. It comes from a different culture, right? And so I think there's just a beauty in that mixture of being able to pick and choose what parts you love and what you want to incorporate and being able to appreciate like, oh, that came from growing up in a predominantly Latino environment. Oh, that came from my roots as being a Filipina, or that came from whatever it is. And so I think that for me, there is some of that compartmentalization of understanding where it came from. But then I think ultimately all those parts make me who I am, and accepting that integrated version is me.
That's so awesome. That's so awesome. Uh, I do have a question about mentality, but I think we're on a really good streak about what do we take from not only our culture growing up, from other culture, and how has it influenced us. So same question. I'll give it off to Julia first, and then Julia, you can pass it to Amanda afterwards.
Okay. You know, what was, I mean, it probably answers your question, but really kind of segue into what Mary Grace was talking about. And going back again to the polycultural study that we did, is that for Gen Z and millennial, the younger generation, American identity, it seems as though isn't aspirational. Whereas in our generation, and then maybe, you know, Gen Xers, being an American was aspirational somewhat. But now more so is that the curiosity of other cultures and how your identity is developed is actually very focused on family. Family experience becomes very, very important in terms of how you formulate your identity. And because of the fact that American culture is so diverse now, that somewhat that identity is not, it's not just an Asian American identity, it's in all sorts of identity development, is that family, you know, we talked about legacy and curiosity towards what family rituals had, and the experience that we had as children or growing up is now really shaping how we feel as American. You know, it might be a hyphen American, or you might just be American, period. But I thought that that was really interesting in terms of really more in terms of leaning into narratives about lived experiences. What is the life that you have experienced, not the kind of historical way that you should be acting as an American. What's an American life anyways, right? And really is that authenticity, it really goes beyond representation. Because of the business that we're in, we get a lot of brands saying that, oh, we need representation in terms of how we communicate communicate as a brand. But we always, you know, representation is actually an easy part of it. But the nuance that comes with authenticity is actually very, very important. So I'm not sure if I answered your question 100%, but I just have some thoughts in terms of what Mary Grace said, in terms of how we're looking at our own identity and how our children's identities are being developed. So I thought that I'd share it in this content.
Please do. Your 2 cents, your point of view is so appreciated.
And I'm curious to hear what Amanda has to say as well too. So
Julia, thank you so much. That was great. And I think it comes down to when I was growing up and first going to school, I was probably one of the only 4 Asian students in the entire school. And so there was no one else. I wanted to be like everybody else because they were the popular ones, or they didn't have the smelly Chinese food, or they spoke the language and didn't have to take English as a second language, you know? So I wanted to be like everybody else. But then as more Asian people started to come in throughout the years, it soon became okay to be me, right? And it's from the people who come before us, like even now you're seeing movies, right? Like big Hollywood blockbuster films with all Asian casts, and that really uplifts the community and shows the younger generation, okay, I can strive to be this too, right? Like if that's what if they got there, I can do that too. And so everybody keeps uplifting the generation before them. And so what you said was really, really important. And thank you for the research that you do.
Oh, everyone, this is so great. I'm telling you, I love these kind of conversations. You're absolutely right. You know, we say representation a lot, and you know, just throwing back what Julia said, it's authenticity. Is how can I live in my truth in order to be the best person I can be, you know, while still attending to my roots. So I want to backtrack and talk about roots real fast. You know, when I first met TJ, it was amazing to see someone who, is Asian is talking about like wealth management and how it really does matter with our mindset. So I'm going to throw it back to Amanda, because just trying to throw up the order here. When you were growing up, was there anything your parents or your relative, your upbringing, that influenced your mindset over money? How did it affect you?
Well, there was a lot actually, because my mom, I grew up in a way that my father abandoned us when we were really young. And so my mom had to work many jobs and work extremely hard in order to keep my brother and I alive. And so money was always a scarce thing. So that's how I grew up. There's not enough of it. You always have to work hard in order to get it. And so that really impacted the way I saw anything that had to do with finances, to where it was like scary, And even every year at tax time, I still get some anxiety, though I know it's from my childhood, and it comes up over and over again. So the way that you're brought up really deeply impacts how you grow up.
Amazing. Yeah, I hear that. You, Mary Grace, how was it growing up for you? Was there any influence on like your upbringing that influenced your not scarcity, but mindset over money?
For me, my parents were very transparent about money. I knew exactly how much they earned. I know how much they put into savings. I knew who borrowed money from the family. Our family was known as the group who could help out other family members or friends. We were always good on finances. And so no matter what, my parents are very big on, we will figure it out. We will be able to do what we need to do. If my dad needed to work night shift and take care of us during the day or whatever it needed to be, or my mom needed to pick up weekend shifts to do whatever she needed to do. So we were a family growing up where being able to make sure that you always paid your bills was a big deal. Making sure that you were able to enjoy your money was also a very big deal. I think some of that comes from the immigrant mentality too, of you don't know if you'll get the chance to be able to enjoy your money, right? And so some of that, I think, which I think is a good thing, right, is making sure that we're not always in savings mode, that we're also enjoying it as well. I think for me, that was really important. And then I think from a money mentality perspective for me, I know this is not sometimes stereotypical of Asian backgrounds, but my parents were very adamant that I earn money in a way by pursuing things that I like to do, that I'm passionate about, and then the money will come, right? So don't chase the money, chase the passion, chase the love, and the money will come with it. And so I know that's not very typical, but and I just thought that was normal, right? I thought everybody was taught that growing up. And so that's what I'm teaching my kids too, is I love that for myself. So I'm hoping I can help that perpetuate with my kids as well, as pursue the stuff that you love. But when it comes to that money mindset, I think the other thing that was really helpful that my dad kind of sprinkled in my mind early on was the notion of entrepreneurship, because there was an expectation that I was going to be the first in all of our family to go to college, right? That was my mom's goal. She said, no one in our family has ever gone to college. Can I just have like my first child go? So, and that was always something that was important to me. But my dad also sprinkled in that, yes, go down that pathway so you have your education to fall back on, and entrepreneurship too is something to think about as well. And so I think that kind of limitlessness that they put in my mind early on of, yeah, you can get whatever job you want, or you can open up a business if you want to, kind of like that kind of gusto, I think was helpful for me in terms of my money mindset and this abundance mindset of, I'll figure it out. If there's a goal that I want to achieve, I'll figure out how to get there. And then I think the other thing I saw growing up a lot too was my parents always donating back to family that is still in the Philippines, right? There's something that's called a balikbayan box, where you put in a bunch of donations, food, clothes, and you send them back. Every year we do that. And even today, my mom was the oldest girl in her family of multiple siblings, and she took care of them. She ultimately took care of them as a teenager. And growing up, I had the opportunity to also send money back to the Philippines to help fund education for my younger cousins, right? And so I think those notions, those examples that were given to me, totally influenced my money mindset.
Beautiful. Oh gosh, this is so beautiful. You really see how you are today has been inflected by your past. Thank you. Thank you. How about you, Julia? What was your upbringing like? How was money spoken about? And on a note of, was there entrepreneurship in your family, or was it discouraged?
I think I might digress a little bit in terms of source of income, and because it's very interesting to hear Amanda, Mary Grace, and I'm pretty sure that TJ will add to the point of view as well too, is that after during COVID and work from home situation is that we have been I'm an entrepreneur myself, so I have my own company, and then I have a number of employees, and it has really during this time, or even maybe a little bit before then, I started to think about how different people maybe feel. Maybe it's because the younger generation feels so comfortable about the source of income, or that it might be that they might not need that much, but I'm not really quite sure. I'm still thinking about it. Is that we had a lot of people at you guys probably know this about quiet quitting, and then people quitting their jobs. And I was really kind of shocked in terms of people quitting without any new job lined up. And they were basically wanting to not necessarily take it easy, but really reset and relook at their lives. And it was very, to a certain degree, it was quite shocking to me, because growing up, I never thought that I could ever not have a job or source of income. That, I don't necessarily come from scarcity per se, but I never thought that I could say, I don't need to work. It was like, if I felt, if there was no source of income, I felt that sense of insecurity that was just a big weight. And I thought that it was very interesting that the newer generation seems to be okay with it. And as kind of like then the maternal attitude comes in terms of thinking about, is it really okay? Do you guys know what you're getting into? So going back to your question in terms of how I grew up, is that I grew up having a sense of insecurity all throughout. We get asked as a business owner in terms of like, what do you think about recession? And my response has always been that I've been in this recession mode every year for the past 30 years, that every single year in my business, I thought the recession was going to hit the next year. It doesn't matter, when people are talking about making record profit, in my mind, next year, we're probably going to go bankrupt. I mean, that's basically the mentality that I had. And that sense of fear almost became a fuel of making sure that everything was buttoned up and that we had something, something in the bank. When people, want new entrepreneurs or students who want to be entrepreneurs ask me, what is the most important thing in terms of running a business? I always say cash flow. It's not new business. It's not new client. It's cash flow. Make sure that you're managing your cash flow well. So, I know that, again, I'm not answering Jenna's question fully, but I mean, that's basically how I have always felt. Probably, and that comes from upbringing and background, is that sense of insecurity is actually a fuel for running a business.
Oh,
Yeah,
gosh.
I want to jump in here because you mentioned cash flow, Julia, and I don't know if everybody's aware, but my money coaching side of the business focuses exclusively on cash flow management. So I just had to plug that in right there. And while I have the mic, I want to speak to this feeling of like being able to quit, right? And not know where your next dollar is coming from. I definitely feel like some of that was just everybody needed a reset, right? Time to reassess. And I definitely had colleagues who at least had spouses that had some income, so they were given that breathing room. But I also think that we've added in this layer of the financial independence, retire early movement has gotten bigger. There's a lot more awareness of that option, that you can have passive income and not have to work for the rest of your life. And there's a lot of those conversations that have been going on. So I think that, in addition to gig culture that has been really big, has really kind of added to that confidence of, I could quit now and not be in a toxic situation or in some situation that's not serving me and figure it out. So it's a weird mix. I wouldn't say necessarily that like fits perfectly into where Mary Grace mentioned the abundance mindset, but that has also been another conversation I've been seeing in the entrepreneurial space, is that as long as you have your brain, as long as you have grit, that you can figure it out, especially with the tools that we've been given in this day and age with technology and willingness to sell and do whatever it takes to get to that place of happiness. And that driving factor is really coming from that sense that we deserve to be happy. And sometimes that means that we need to take a break, that we've all been burned out. And talking about the concept of feeling like next year is definitely the recession, no matter how things are going, that kind of is the same way when you're working for somebody else and you're burnt out and you're just like, oh, well, if I give up on this now, where are my opportunities coming from? And at some point when you're burnt out, there's just no choice anymore. You just have to give up. You have to say, this isn't serving me. This is not healthy, whatever it is. And then you make the decision to detach, and that looks different for everyone. So I'm actually really curious, Mary Grace, what quiet quitting has looked like in your experience, because I know you have a day job, and anything else you want to comment on in that space.
Sure. So I do have a day job. So I do have a corporate role. I run 2 businesses on the side as well. And I think the notion of quiet quitting, very interesting. And I'm going to go back to something Julia said too about that fear of not having that security, right? And just having that boldness of saying, who cares, whatever happens next, right? I think for me, because even my parents have mentioned over the years, right? Even in the previous recession, what if you lose your job, or what if your job gets eliminated? And my response had always been the same, which is, then I'll find another one I like, right? And so I think part of that comes from, and I got this advice really early on in my career, which was stay relevant. So whatever is happening, right? Making sure that you're adding value, making sure that you are liking the work. I think all of that, at least for me personally, it gives me the confidence to feel like, okay, I've got skills that are marketable in whatever it is that may happen. And if I need to shift over to something else, there are so many other things that I can also do. And knowing that my identity isn't necessarily tied to just one company, right? That it's a skill set that I like to explore. It's contributions I like to make, causes I care about, problems I want to solve, and that there's going to be another opportunity. The other thing from a financial standpoint is making sure you have runway to allow for that sort of transition, right? So I also want to make sure that I'm putting up sound a perspective here of, it's not completely without planning, of making sure you have at least a 6 to 12 month runway of whatever to make sure if you do need time for that transition. But I think that the notion of quiet quitting, and what I've seen and what I've heard, even from hanging out with friends over dinner and asking about the work that they do, I think that sometimes what happens is, if you are in work that you aren't really either passionate about or love or are tied to in terms of purpose, those questions come up, right? Of, am I being valued? Am I on a trajectory of promotion? And I think a role where you are passionate about it, you're working for a boss that you love, or if you're the one who is the boss, that it's a company you love, if you are clear about growth trajectory, I think all of those things, if they're not in place, then that question comes up about value, right? Am I making the money that I should be? Am I having the title that I can have? And I think that's where quiet quitting comes from, is this, for me, at least, this notion of, is there something more? Because I'm not being fulfilled right now with what I'm doing. And so I do think with the pandemic, there is a lot of time for people to reflect, right? And whether we liked it or not, there is just a ton of time for people to reevaluate. Do I have the work-life integration that I want? Am I achieving the type of goals and life goals that I want? Am I working with the type of people I care about? And if the answer to that was no, right, it gave people this long stretch of reflection to be able to reevaluate that. And I think this notion of quiet quitting, I feel like, is really a question of reevaluating what work-life integration should look like for each person. because with that is not just work, but also what does your life look like? And do you have the life design that's best fit for where you are today? So for me, the notion of quiet quitting, I'm seeing it all the time. I'm in the Silicon Valley. I see all sorts of people moving around. And I think it's because people were in roles that may not have been hitting the marks and what they might have wanted to achieve from a work-life integration perspective.
Amazing. No, that's fantastic. I mean, I see. Do you have any comments about quiet quitting or the corporate life?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Mary Grace was saying, a couple things. Is I think the younger generation is just not willing to settle for what the previous generation was willing to settle for. So if the previous generation was willing to settle for somebody working them super hard, or for having a boss that was insulting them or saying things that weren't appropriate, but they were scared and they stayed anyway, the next generation was no longer going to accept that. And so it was easier. Go ahead.
I have to say that, like, I would argue my dad has been quiet quitting for like the 5 years before he officially retired. He just chose like, oh, I don't think that project's a great idea. I'm going to let it die by not touching it. Like those types of things. He'd have these conversations with me. But I do think there is a difference too in like we have this conversation a lot of like the loyalty between employee and employer has shifted where you're no longer a lifetime employee. That's not guaranteed anymore. I would say there are people out there who still work at companies like that. And especially my colleagues who are 25, 30 years of experience with the same company, they continue to enjoy that loyalty. But those of us that are a little bit younger, we're not seeing it, guys. This is not happening. This is not reality. My generation, or at least my classmates and I graduated shortly after the recession, and we saw the layoffs while we were thinking about what is our career going to be, what path are we going to take. So it was very impactful to us to really question the wisdom that our parents would hand down to us. I know when I accepted my first official paid internship, my dad was like, don't worry about the money, just like whatever you're going to learn or the connections and experience. And I was like, yeah, but excuse me, like maybe that was okay for you, but female, minority in a predominantly white environment, in a predominantly masculine environment in IT, I was like, this is not the conversation we've been having about how like more women need to negotiate their starting salary, or that we need to get more out of our careers based off of the circumstances we had. I couldn't just rely on what my parents told me as much as we in the Asian culture value like the wisdom of our elders.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It brings me back to what Julia said, that, do we serve out of this fear? Because you're not talking about fear, TJ, but you're talking about like this, how do I say it? Like the worst thing can happen. The worst thing can happen. I can't gather my thoughts, but just want to sit in that for a second.
Maybe where you're going with this is like, we've already seen like the worst could happen, right? Like we've seen true evidence. It wasn't just like a myth of what was possible. And we've also been handed a lot of things like talking about like follow your bliss, and like if you like love your job, you're not really working, right? Like those types of quotes like were handed to us with the reality of the world we were living in, and we're sitting here going, okay, where do we fit in? And I feel like especially in the Silicon Valley, because definitely grew up there, and thinking about how my classmates and I were kind of given this prerogative of, get relevant skills, get the education, the types of things that like people can't take away from you, or if you have a physical disability, you could probably still work. Those types of skills were so emphasized in my upbringing, not just by my parents, but by everybody's parents. And that's kind of like fed off of itself because we would pass those on to each other. And I do feel like part of what made my upbringing so toxic was that we lost sight of why. Of that, like the skills were kind of roughly tied to the concept of like, you need to make money to survive, so you should have these skills. But when you take those skills and you're like, okay, so-and-so told me that this is how you make money, right? There are a lot of accountants who go into accounting because they're told that like you make a solid salary right out of college. And the number of accountants who then go, yo, this is not for me, right? Like most of us don't like numbers in the first place. And like that, I really felt like was a cause of a lot of angst with my classmates and myself in terms of being told this is the career you should have. You need to be a doctor, you need to be a lawyer, whatever it was. And kind of just like following that train because that was the path we were put on. And then hitting the pandemic and going, we don't have any other way to distract ourselves. So we realize how much that like what we were told to or who we were told to be didn't match who we really were.
That's amazing. I think this conversation has been really enlightened about just shared experience of our upbringings and doing more. I don't think we're in the wanting phase. I think we're in the doing phase. And I hear from everyone of how they're making, is it The Alchemist? How they're turning, magic from dust. So I know we're nearly at time. I want to give it to TJ to talk about what's coming up your next season for the Asian Detox.
Yeah, thanks, Jenna. So for season 2, we are taking a hiatus. The last episode of season 1 went out a couple of Wednesdays ago, and we're taking a break because what I found is, first of all, I need to upskill some of my interviewing skills. It's not that anything was bad, it's that it could be better, right? I have some ambition and some aspirations because I am a podcast listener myself, and I know how good it could be. So what I am doing is we're taking this time off. We're going to have season 2 start roughly in January. My goal is to have the first 2 episodes out before Lunar New Year in January. But we're doing basically pre-recording. We're getting all our guests instead of doing like, oh, let's record this a month before the episode drops and then have the production, post-production happen. We're going to try to record all of season 2 all at once and not necessarily have a particular order, but we do have a theme around self-care and the immigrant experience. And based off of how those conversations go, because they can sometimes be like, we could have internet issues or we have technical problems, or we could just drag on. It may not be a good fit for the podcast. So basically this is my way of adapting and getting a product that I can be proud of out there for season 2. And that includes taking any feedback from the audience and the guests that we've had so far to make that a better experience for them as well. And once we have all of those together, then it's just a matter of releasing them and letting everybody know that those episodes are out there.
I'm so excited for you. You're definitely starting conversations about empowerment in the Asian community of bringing the money back, bringing healthy mentality back. So just to wrap us up, so Amanda, Julia, Mary Grace, in that order, tell me about where audience can find you. Social media, emails, newsletter, or what are you up to next?
Sure. So for myself, you can find me on Instagram at dr.amandachan or on my website, optimizemyhealing.com.
Is it me next?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, Julia, can find you next.
Please go to our website, innertrend.com, on Instagram, innertrend, and also Make Noise Today.
And for me, you can find me on Instagram, Mary Grace Gardner, and there I post all about corporate life, my businesses, raising 3 little humans. So if you'd like to follow any of that, go to Mary Grace Gardner on Instagram.
Amazing. TJ, and where can we find you and the Asian Detox?
Yep. So for the podcast on Instagram, it's Asian_Detox. And we also have the website, theasiandetoxpodcast.com. So you can find all the episodes there. And of course, on any of your podcast platforms, definitely hit the subscribe button because that helps us market the podcast as well. And then for anything about my money coaching or me personally, you can follow me on Instagram at tj.wey.
Amazing. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us wherever you're listening to this. This is Jenna Lam. I'm so happy to be part of this conversation and listen to all the wisdom. So with that, thank you and have a good night, morning, afternoon. Bye-bye.